The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Michael Mann says it's a new day in the climate battle that can only be fought by believing we can still make a difference. Kerry L. Haynie on the record number of women of color in elected office and why it matters. Plus, Bill Press with the Brennan Center's Eliza Sweren-Becker on the surge in GOP-led efforts to suppress voting. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Climate scientist Michael Mann has achieved fame for his work in proving climate change is happening. He says that even as we move past climate denialism, the battle over how to take action against global warming is as urgent as ever. And we say hello to Michael Mann, Distinguished Professor of Meteorology at Penn State University, also the Director of the Penn State Earth Systems Science Center, or ESSC, and the author most recently of The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. Michael Mann, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Oh, thank you, Jim. It's great to be with you.
And great for us to have you with us. You've been at the forefront of the climate war for decades. Your new book is about how it's a different kind of war than when you began your work. Is it safe to say that this is a war defined more about how we fight climate change as opposed to denying the fact that it even exists?
Yeah, that's precisely the case. For decades, we witnessed basic attacks, assaults by fossil fuel interests and those promoting their agenda on the basic scientific evidence. And scientists like myself were at the receiving end, not only of efforts to discredit our work, but efforts to intimidate us and even threats of violence. So the good news is that we've largely moved beyond that to a large extent because you just can't deny climate change is happening anymore. The forces of inaction, the inactivists, as I call them in the book, fossil fuel interests and those doing their bidding, recognize that it isn't credible anymore to claim that climate change is happening, to really try to go after the basic scientific evidence. So instead, they've turned to a new set of tactics. The old climate war was the effort to discredit the basic science and the scientists. The new climate war is this new set of tactics that they've turned to because, look, they haven't given up. Fossil fuel interests aren't just going to roll over. They want to continue to make billions of dollar profits year after year, and they're going to do everything they can to extend that as far into the future as they can. And that means now turning to an insidious array of other tactics to try to thwart the decarbonization of our economy, to try to stop or block the effort to leave our addiction of fossil fuels and move towards renewable energy. And those tactics include efforts to divide climate advocates, deflection away from the need for systemic solutions towards individual behavioral action.
Michael, I want to touch on something that you just touched on. You warn against an emphasis on individual action. So where exactly is that message coming from, and how does it impede the fight against climate change?
Yeah, so, it's important to recognize that, of course, we should engage in those, actions, those behaviors that help reduce our environmental footprint, that help reduce our carbon footprint. And in many cases, these are things that save us money, they make us happier and healthier, and they set a good example for other people. So we should, of course, do all those things. What we can't allow to happen is for those who are not in favor of meaningful policy change to somehow deflect attention entirely towards individual behavior to the exclusion of the needed policies that we need. Because after all, neither you nor I can put a price on carbon or provide subsidies for fossil fuel, to provide subsidies for renewable energy, or take away subsidies for fossil fuels, or block funding for new fossil fuel infrastructure. These are things we need our government to do. And the forces of inaction, the inactivists, have actually sort of fanned the flames of this, tendency to focus on individual behavior. It's an old tactic. The beverage industry used this back in the 1970s, the famous Crying Indian advertisement with the tearful Native American that impacted a whole generation. And it was about, cleaning up the environment. And we all thought it was this very empowering, and inspiring sort of ad campaign, those of us who were growing up at the time, only to learn now, that it was actually a ruse. It was a propaganda campaign hatched on Madison Avenue by Coca-Cola in the beverage industry. They didn't want to see bottle bills pass in the various states, which would require the returning and processing of bottles and cans. It would clean up the litter, but it would hurt their bottom line, their profits. So instead, they funded this major advertising campaign to make it all about individual behavior. You and I just have to be better environmental stewards and pick up those cans and bottles. We don't need a systemic solution to this problem. And thanks to their efforts, we now have, along with global climate change, one of the other great global environmental crises of the day, global plastic pollution. And we have the beverage industry and their deflection campaign to thank for that. So the fossil fuel industry, picked up that, they've run with that playbook, and they've used the same tactics. The notion of an individual carbon footprint was actually popularized by BP in the early 2000s. And they came out with one of the first individual carbon footprint calculators, because they want us focusing on our carbon footprint rather than theirs. And so that's really what we're talking about, the effort by fossil fuel interests to make the conversation entirely about individual behavioral change, so that we're not talking about the needed systemic changes in policies. And it's been very effective. I mean, even our leading media outlets, the New York Times, to a large extent, has actually bought into that framing.
I pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, I guess. Is,
exactly.
Kind of a scenario for this. You also warn against doom and gloom scenarios that suggest we're past a tipping point to do anything about climate change. Again, where is that message coming from, and what is its impact on the climate change movement?
Yeah, so it's another one of those cases where the people who are genuinely concerned about the problem have become victims in, once again, a very effective tactic here, an effort to convince them that, in fact, it's so bad that it's too late to do anything about that. And so understandably, there are people who are very concerned, and there does need to be a sense of urgency, because this is a crisis. The climate, there's a reason we call it the climate crisis. It's a crisis. But we also know, and the science tells us, that there is still time to make the changes necessary to avert the worst impacts of climate change. So we have urgency, but as I like to say, there is also agency. We can still make a direct difference. And what and we see this largely in online fora, social media, where bad state actors, petrostate actors like Russia, have tried to use bots and trolls online to sort of steer the climate discourse in a direction that's preferential to their agenda. Russia, their greatest assets right now are their fossil fuels still in the ground. And Putin believes that they will prosper from the continued extraction and sale of their fossil fuels. Putin has even gone on record saying he thinks climate change would be good for Russia. Well, that's not true at all. And the Siberian wildfires of 2010 should have told them otherwise. But because of that, they and other potentially other state actors have sort of manipulated online discussions to, try to defeat efforts, policy efforts, interfere in other countries like France, Australia, and Canada, and the United States when it comes to carbon pricing legislation, to try to make that unpopular, to try to turn public tide against it. And they have, for example, fanned the flames of doomism. We see trolls and bots that have promoted this sort of messaging. And there are, there are organizations that actually track this stuff, and they can tell if a particular online conversation is being driven by bots that are and bots that are likely state controlled. And there is evidence that indeed is going on, and much of their messaging, among other things, is that it's too late to do anything. And so the victims are, in large part, environmental progressives who actually care about the problem, but ironically are being convinced that it's too late to do anything about it. And that's really what is so pernicious about this particular effort, because look, the forces of inaction largely have had the right side of our political spectrum on board for their agenda of climate inaction. Here, they're actually co-opting folks on the left, weaponizing them for their agenda.
Wow. That's just amazing to me. Moving to what has to happen now, what are the actual policies that governments need to be taking to counter the power and influence of fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel countries, for instance, Russia?
Well, the bad news is, of course, under the previous president, Donald Trump was directly facilitating that sort of behavior, complicit in those efforts, not only in domestic efforts by fossil fuel interests to dismantle meaningful environmental policies and climate policies, but actually enabling bad actors like Russia to stir the pot in the way that they've been doing. That's the bad news. The good news is, of course, we've seen a dramatic shift in direction now with the new administration. And Joe Biden has signaled two very important things right out of the starting gate. One, the United States is now once again going to lead the global effort to act on climate. We are going to display the sort of moral and actual leadership that we once did on this issue. And I think that will have huge implications for other countries that have been waffling. Countries like Australia are going to feel newfound pressure now that the United States is once really back in the game. At the same time, the Biden administration has indicated that they are no longer going to tolerate this sort of behavior by Russia. And so you can expect to see quite a bit of pushback against efforts by Russia and other foreign actors to try to manipulate public opinion through, the various cyber sort of espionage and cyber operations that they've been engaged in.
Mm-hmm. And the president has described it as climate change, that is, as a maximum threat that must be met with urgency. We've seen some actions taken so far. But with that emphasis of the Biden administration to fight climate change, do you have any concerns that he may not go far enough?
I think a lot of us did, and those concerns are really sort of melting away because he really has taken surprisingly bold steps very early on. It's remarkable to me that he's actually made climate sort of one of his four central issues that he says he wants to focus on in the first 100 days. And among his first acts, his first executive actions, a whole day was devoted to climate and signing a whole array of executive actions that I characterized at the time, and I would continue to characterize as coming as close as you could possibly come through executive actions alone in implementing a Green New Deal. I mean, the policies, the executive actions that he's taking look a lot like the policy goals of the sort of Green New Deal legislation that's been proposed by folks like AOC and Ed Markey. And the reality is that to really see to really move forward on climate, we're going to need legislation as well. We're going to need climate legislation, no question about that. A set of bills that legislate the same sort of principles that Biden is trying to embrace in these executive actions. But I mean, he's gone about as far with executive actions as a chief executive could really go. And I think he's going to be working very closely with Democrats who've shown some real spine here as well, who, in the old days were willing to give in to the sorts of tactics used by Republicans, filibusters to prevent any meaningful climate action. You needed 60 votes. The Democrats have said enough of that. We're going to pass this stuff through reconciliation with 50 votes and a tie-breaking vote by the vice president, if that's what we need to do. And so I am very hopeful, not only that we are seeing action already on the executive front, but that we will see that complemented with real climate legislation.
We were speaking with Michael Mann, Distinguished Professor of Meteorology at Penn State University, also Director of the Penn State ESSC, and author most recently of The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. Michael, you argue that this is a fight that all of us need to be a part of, and you describe the work of the youth climate movement as a game changer. What can we all learn from this movement?
Yeah, so, they've been inspiring, and I'm, proud to, call Greta Thunberg, who's sort of effectively the leader of that global movement, a friend. And I have done everything that I can do as an adult to try to support the actions these kids are taking, while at the same time trying to signal to my fellow adults that we can't put this on the kids. This is about our ethical obligation to them. They're not in a position at this point, most of them, to vote and to directly impact policy. But they are impacting the conversation. They are impacting the discussion. They've given us sort of a foot in the door, and now the rest of us have to walk through that door. And we have to make sure that their efforts are not in vain, and that we do everything that we can to make sure that our legacy is not a degraded planet for future generations. We, to an extent, have started the important turn in that direction with this last election, where we did vote in a president who campaigned on climate, has a mandate to act on climate, and is already implementing it. And amazingly, with those two wins in North Carolina, by the narrowest of margins, but a Democratic Senate, that will bring climate legislation to the floor, and I think pass it. And so it's up to the rest of us now to be inspired by these kids, to recognize that this is about something much greater than science and policy and economics and politics. It's about ethics, about intergenerational ethics, about the ethics, the ethical quandary that those who created this problem, industrial nations, have created a problem where those who had the least role, the developing world, are going to see the worst impacts and have the least resilience and the least adaptive capacity. And so, more than anything else, this is an ethical. Climate change is a crisis in ethics, and we have to make sure that that our legacy not be that we saw the problem and failed to act in time.
And before we let you go, you have expressed cautious optimism that we are heading in the right direction on climate change, even as its impact becomes clearer. What gives you reason for continued optimism? Yeah,
well, it's a number of things. We've talked about probably two principal reasons for that optimism. The inspirational nature of the youth climate movement that has really finally recentered this conversation where it needed to be all along, about our ethical obligation to act. I think that's created real opportunity. It has intersected with important social movements. we have gone through some very important tipping points of the good kind. There are tipping points of the bad kind, climate tipping points that we hope to avoid and that we must try to avoid. But then there's social tipping points like marriage equality. And now, a few years ago, we saw this dramatic shift in public opinion. And now we have a much more progressive sort of set of policies when it comes to marriage equality here in the United States. I believe we are going through such a moment on issues of racial justice. And of course, those issues intersect in a profound way with environmental justice and with the climate crisis. And so I think that has created an appetite, an activism for climate action, unlike anything we've seen before. And that is happened to coincide with a favorable shift in the political winds, a favorable enough shift. I would have liked to have seen large majorities, Democratic majorities, swept into Congress in that last election. In that eventuality, we probably would have seen the passage of extremely bold, far-reaching, expansive Green New Deal-like legislation. It's going to be tougher with a 50-50 Senate, with a tie-breaking vote by the vice president. And so we're probably going to have to settle for somewhat more modest climate legislation, but it will keep the ball moving forward. And along with the executive actions the administration is taking, it gets us started on this path. And maybe 2 years from now, we'll have an even more favorable political environment, where we can pass even more expansive climate legislation. But I feel like we can get something done right now legislatively. We've got a lot of wind in our sails in terms of what the Biden administration is doing, the people he's appointed, and the way they have really spread out climate across the agenda of every single government agency and every single cabinet level appointment. So if you're looking for reasons to be optimistic about climate action, there are a whole bunch of them right now. As I've said before, this is our time.
It's refreshing to have an optimistic conversation about climate change, which we have just done, and it's very much appreciated. Michael Mann, Distinguished Professor of Meteorology at Penn State University, and also the author most recently of The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. Michael, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
That sounds great. It was really a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks again.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Social Security measure. I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, women of color won congressional seats in record numbers. How will they legislate? But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Let's say you're a millionaire. That's a lot of money, right? Now let's say you're a billionaire. That's a lot more money. But how much more? Think of all those dollars as seconds on a clock. 1,000,000 seconds would total 11 days. But a billion seconds equals nearly 32 years. Rich is nice, but billionaire rich is over the moon. And the wealth of billionaires is now zooming out of this world. There are only 2,200 of these uber-rich dudes in the world, but the wealth stashed away by these elites hit a new record this summer, averaging more than $4 billion each. On average, they've even pocketed an extra $500 million in the midst of the COVID-19 economic crash. Bear in mind that these fortunate few did nothing to earn this haul. They didn't work harder, didn't get one digit smarter, didn't create some new breakthrough product to benefit humankind. They just cranked back in their gold-plated lazy boys and let their money make money for them. Then there are multimillionaire corporate chieftains who are cashing in on their own failure, having closed stores throughout America, fired thousands of workers, stiffed suppliers and creditors, taken bailout money from taxpayers, and even led their corporations into bankruptcy. The CEOs of such collapsing giants as Hertz, JCPenney, and Toys R Us have grabbed millions of dollars in, believe it or not, bonus payments. The typical employee at JCPenney, for example, is held to part-time work, making under $12,000 a year. Thousands of them are now losing even that miserly income as the once mighty retailer is shutting 154 stores. Yet, the CEO was paid a $4.5 million cash bonus before the company filed for bankruptcy this year. This is Jim Hightower saying, and still the corporate establishment wonders why the people consider it a club of heartless, greedy bastards.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. In his newest book, political scientist Kerry Haynie, along with his co-authors, explores the intersection of race and gender in today's political arena. He says, with more women of color in Congress than ever before, expect them to make a difference in important ways. And we say hello to Kerry L. Haynie, an associate professor of political science and African American studies at Duke University. He directs Duke's Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Gender in the Social Sciences and is co-author with Beth Reingold and Kirsten Wittner of the recently published book, Race, Gender, and Political Representation Toward a More Intersectional Approach. Kerry Haynie, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Jim, thanks for having me.
Well, our pleasure to have you with us. And along with your co-authors, you've written a book about how race and gender intersect to influence elected officials and the issues they focus on. First, why was this an important book to write even before the November election that brought a historic number of women of color into Congress?
Jim, over the past 3 decades or so, there's quite a bit of political science research that's uncovered evidence that race and gender influence representation in the U.S. However, when studying race and gender, political scientists and others have often assumed that there were no gender differences among minority representatives and no racial differences among female representatives. And in our book, we examine the extent to which political representation is race and gendered. A good common example of this, there's been talk about the year of the woman in politics in 1992 and some other years of the women. If you look beneath the surface, it's actually the year of the women of color as opposed to the year of the woman. So if you look only at race and only at gender, we get a misleading picture of what's actually going on in politics.
How did you go about the research for the book?
Well, we did, and this is some research that's been in the making for some number of years. We published several articles along the way to the book. And in the book, we look at legislation introduced in 15 different state legislatures in 1997 and 2005. And again, we're interested mostly in how the combination of race and gender shape the issues that legislators choose to introduce and represent.
As you recently wrote in the Washington Post, Kerry, when you looked at race and gender separately, your findings were consistent with prior research. What do we already know about how men and women in office and those of different ethnicities tend to differ in terms of the kind of legislation they'll sponsor?
Yes. It's been a long established in the research that Black legislators are more likely to introduce bills that represent Black interests, women more likely to represent interests of women, and Latinx legislators more likely to introduce and represent the interests of Latinx people. That was already established, including in some of our own research. We were interested in how race and gender intersect in representation.
So you weren't surprised initially by what you found. You almost expected it.
Absolutely. We expected to see, Blacks being more likely to represent Black interests than whites and so on and so forth. And I should say, however, that, we're not making an argument that only Blacks can represent Black interests or only women can represent women's interests. Because there was a time when neither Blacks nor women were in legislatures, but they were represented in some respects. What we argue is that they do a better job than others.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you focus on the intersection of race and gender, you reveal even more differences. Your research established that women of color are more likely to address the needs of marginalized communities. So beginning with issues of poverty and social welfare, how are women of color shaping policy in a different way?
Yeah, so what we find that women of color are most likely to address the needs of multiple marginalized groups with their legislative portfolios. That is to say that, for example, Black women are more likely to introduce bills that target the way that different types of disadvantage intersect, especially with regards to low income and communities of color. So they pay attention not to the single axis issues, but the intersection of various kinds of disadvantage.
We're speaking to Kerry Haynie, an associate professor of political science and African American studies at Duke University. He's also co-author with Beth Reingold and Kirsten Widner of the recently published book, Race, Gender, and Political Representation Toward a More Intersectional Approach. You also found important distinctions in the way women of color approach legislation around criminal justice. What did you observe when you looked at this issue?
Yeah, so we found that women of color were more likely to introduce legislation that would, for example, restore the perpetrators of crime to full economic, familial, and civic participation once they had finished their sentence. So they would introduce bills that would punish crime, but would also pay attention to those who had committed the crimes to make sure they had an opportunity to come back into full civic and life and economic life.
And that could be voting rights and any number of other things as well.
For example, they would introduce legislation, right? We would see women of color introducing bills to expunge criminal records after some period of time. Also to expand education and vocational opportunities for folks who were incarcerated, preparing them to leave jail and prison and come back into life with better chances for taking advantage of educational, economic opportunities.
Mm-hmm. This research, Kerry, certainly brings considerable weight to the argument that more diversity in Congress matters. We now have a record-breaking number of women of color in Congress and a woman of color in the White House. What kind of impact are we already seeing, and could we see in the future on what happens in Congress?
Yes, I think we are already seeing the agenda that the Congress will address being shaped by women of color. Again, in terms of some of these intersectional issues, that dealing with poverty, that often that goes hand in hand with economic development, is sort of not looking singly at issues of poverty, but also at issues of opportunity, educational, economic, issues about student loans, right? That we do something with the debt that folks have. So it's taken a intersectional approach to ordinary issues of crime, poverty, and the like.
And of course, it took way too long to get to this point, way too much time. historically, what have been the barriers that have kept women of color from holding political office, and what's changing so that more are now able to achieve that goal?
There have been a number of barriers over the years. Money is a big one. Being able to have access to the networks that would allow you to raise the extraordinary amount of money that it requires to win a seat in a legislature, Congress or Senate seat. And even now in state legislatures, it's becoming quite competitive and expensive to run. So money is one. The lack of recruitment on the part of the political parties. The parties have not been aggressive or active in recruiting women candidates. So that's another issue. And also some evidence of voters not looking at women of color in particular as suitable candidates for public office.
Where does that come from, right? I mean, that's a societal issue that I would think that there's no reason for that.
Yeah, just the historical vestiges of, gender bias and racial bias in the society. We see that also happening in politics, but it's changing. It's changing quickly in the last few decades.
Yeah, well, and hopefully it will continue to change and change rapidly as we move forward. Kerry Haynie, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at Duke University, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Also would encourage you to check out the book that he co-authored with Beth Reingold and Kirsten Widner, Race, Gender, and Political Representation Toward a More Intersectional Approach. Kerry, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
Happy to do it, and more than happy to come back. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press with Eliza Sweren-Becker, counsel for the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, on what's next in the GOP's unprecedented campaign to restrict voting rights.
This election was not stolen, correct?
That's correct. This was one of the most, if not the most secure elections in history. There were no credible allegations of election fraud or irregularities that would have changed the results in any race. Allegations about election fraud were debunked in court after court after court and have been debunked, over time by academic experts who have shown that instances of fraud are exceedingly, exceedingly rare.
Right. And in fact, 2020 may really end up being known as the election with the largest turnout yet in American presidential history.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, voters turned out in unprecedented numbers, and they overcame unprecedented challenges, voting during a viral, fatal pandemic. And election administrators really stepped up to the plate also and helped voters cast their ballots in a way that was safe during the pandemic.
Right. So the other result, or another result, certainly, of Trump's big lie, as you at the Brennan Center pointed out, is not only this invasion of the Capitol, but this rush in many, many states across the country to suppress the vote. You've recently released a study, results of your analysis. What did you find?
We found that in 33 states across the country, that there are at least 165 bills to restrict access to voting.
Wow.
And yeah,
165 in 33 states.
And that's just as of this week. There are more bills being introduced as the legislative sessions continue across the country. But many of these bills have, either by their sponsors in public statements or in the bill language themselves, they draw on that lie that the president has told about election fraud and election irregularities and use that lie as a justification to advance these measures to restrict voting access.
So a direct result of Donald Trump's big lie.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, anytime we have an election year where voters turn out, there is always the following year an effort to suppress voter access. But this is really unprecedented in 2021 after what we've been through last year.
Is this an organized effort? I mean, I don't know. There used to be a group called ALEC, America Legislative Something Council, sponsored by the Koch brothers that sent around to various states the same legislation. So you would see it popping up in various states. Is this organized by any group like ALEC or just popping up?
It's not organized in that way that I'm aware of. And while we are certainly seeing themes in the kinds of restrictive bills that state lawmakers are introducing, we're not seeing, word for word exact language, at least not yet. But election law is quite complicated and it's different in every state. It's not really the kind of code that you could provide a one-size-fits-all solution to every state in order to make the kinds of changes that are being sought here, whether that's no excuse mail voting or restrictions on sending ballots to voters. The proposals are very tailored to the particularities of the existing election law in a given state.
And are we talking about only red states?
We're seeing bills to restrict voting access, not just from red states. We're seeing it from in states across the country, including states that are blue or purple. But the vast majority of these bills have been introduced by Republican lawmakers.
And what are the main things that you see that the states try to do to suppress the vote?
The big trend that we're seeing this year are efforts to restrict mail voting. And that is, of course, after last year, so many voters in unprecedented numbers, used mail and absentee voting to cast their ballots safely during a pandemic. And as a result, mail voting is now a target for lawmakers across the country looking to put roadblocks at every stage, whether that's how to get a ballot, how to make sure the ballot gets in on time, making sure the ballot gets counted. Lawmakers are trying to put stumbling blocks in each step of the way.
And what's the reality about vote by mail? First of all, it's been around a long time. Have there been serious problems with fraud with absentee ballots?
You're right that vote by mail has been around a long time, and it's largely been uncontroversial prior to last year. That's because voters like it. They like having an opportunity to cast their ballot in a more convenient way. And it's very secure. There haven't been any problems identified with mail ballots. It hasn't been the source of any kind of mail voter fraud or anything of the kind that was alleged last year. So historically, mail voting has been used equally by both parties for the most part, and it's been used happily. So this attack on mail voting really seems to be a clear backlash to the widespread use of it last year.
Vote by mail is one target. Early voting, another one?
Yes. So last year, we saw voters take advantage of a number of different ways to cast their ballots. Mail voting was one, but early voting was another. And we're seeing efforts to restrict opportunities to vote early in a number of states as well.
How about drop boxes?
Yes. The issue of drop boxes became a topic of a lot of litigation last year, although in many states they had been used, again, quite uncontroversially for quite some time. And now we're seeing a number of states introduce bills that would prohibit drop boxes or place limitations on how they can be used.
Just prohibit them altogether?
Yes.
And the other measures, some states have an automatic voter registration, for example, when you get your driver's license or whatever. Some of those under attack as well?
Yes. So automatic voter registration is a policy that's in place in 19 states and the District of Columbia. And it just switches the registration process from an opt-out to an opt-in. So when voters interact with a state agency, for example, the DMV, if they qualify, if they're eligible to vote, they will automatically be registered unless they opt out. Mm-hmm. But there are a couple of states with automatic voter registration that have seen bills to repeal, and that would be in Georgia and Alaska. And Arizona, a legislator has introduced a bill to prohibit automatic voter registration, even though the state doesn't have that policy currently.
You mentioned Georgia. Tell us about Georgia. Because of Stacey Abrams, I think most of us, if we think voter suppression, we think about Georgia. How What's the story in Georgia? Is it still as bad as it was? And are they one of the states that's still trying to suppress the vote?
Yes, absolutely. In recent weeks, the lawmakers in Georgia have introduced a slew of bills to restrict voting access, including a bill to require a photocopy of identification with absentee ballot applications and with absentee ballots, a bill to prohibit the use of drop boxes, for example, a bill to eliminate no excuse mail voting there. So these are bills to eliminate policies that have been used successfully in the state to help voters register or to help them cast their ballots safely and securely. So the efforts at voter suppression in Georgia remain alive and well.
Are efforts to suppress the vote aimed at any particular part of the electorate in your study?
Well, any effort to restrict voting access typically has a greater burden on voters of color and voters at the margins more generally. So whether that's poorer voters or voters with disabilities, voters who have, for one reason or another, fewer resources. And that those resources might be time, those resources might be physical ability, those resources might be access to government agencies to obtain the necessary ID. So those are voters who are going to have a greater difficulty overcoming the barriers that are put in their way in terms of these voter suppressive laws.
So they may not say it or admit it, but it sounds like these state legislatures are directly targeting segments of the population that would most likely have a heavy Democratic majority. Would you agree?
Well, I think that efforts
people of color, young people, college students, whatever.
Yes, certainly these efforts are intended, I think, or many of these voter suppressive efforts are designed to have a particular partisan outcome potentially. But what we've seen is that these policies would actually restrict access beyond whomever is the target. So the population that typically uses mail voting the most are older white voters. So restrictions on mail voting access are not just going to hit voters of color, but that those restrictions are also going to burden older voters, white voters, who may vote differently than the voting bloc of voters of color.
And you did mention, and I should ask you about this because this has been an issue for quite some time, which is the voter ID, that you have to have some photo ID when you vote. How common is that now, and what's the impact of that requirement?
Well, various states have different voter ID rules. Some states don't require ID at all. Other states have strict voter ID requirements. But this year, we are seeing 18 states have 40 bills to impose new or stricter voter ID requirements. And that includes states that don't have any ID requirement at all. There are 10 states that are seeing bills that would introduce new ID requirements. Other bills would make ID requirements stricter or limit what kinds of IDs can be used, like New Hampshire would limit whether student IDs could be used. But we tend to see that voters of color are typically less likely to have the required ID to vote in states that do have voter ID requirements. So that is particularly the kind of policy that would disproportionately burden voters of color.
So what can be done, or what is being done to actually, or are there any measures to expand the vote?
Absolutely. So at the same time as we're seeing concerted efforts to limit voting access, we are also seeing hundreds of bills that have been introduced to expand voter access and make it easier for voters to cast their ballots. And as you might imagine, those policies are directed at mail voting and early voting, policies that were very successful in their use last year. But we're also seeing other efforts that would ease voter registration, like taking automatic voter registration to new states, or that would restore voting rights to people with past convictions. So restoring the right to vote to those who, because of a felony conviction in their past or incarceration, have lost that right.
Right. But by the way, I meant to ask you this earlier. With this wave of voter suppression measures in all the states, 165 you mentioned in 33 states, how's that compare with what we saw last year?
Well, it dwarfs what we saw last year. there are nearly 4 times as many restrictive bills as we saw at about this time last year.
Wow.
So certainly the effort and the interest in limiting voter access is very keen among state lawmakers this year.
Okay, so if the Brennan Center wants to, a state comes to you, or a governor, secretary of state, and says, okay, now what should our state election law look like in order to to encourage people to vote, make it easier for the most people to vote? What steps should we take? What would your advice be?
Well, one of the things I would point to are many of the policies that are in the For the People Act, or H.R. 1, which is a federal bill that would enact a number of democracy reforms across the country. And those reforms include things like automatic voter registration, online registration, same-day voter registration, limitations on purge practices, prohibitions on voter caging and other intimidation practices. The bill includes the Democracy Restoration Act, which would restore voting rights to people who are living in the community who lost their voting rights because of past convictions. No excuse mail voting, early voting. So these are sort of common sense provisions that many states have adopted, but in some states, they have not yet included. And this federal bill would implement those policies for federal elections across the country. So there's a great model already out there in the form of H.R. 1 that states can begin adopting now, and hopefully that Congress will enact and implement soon.
Ideally, early voting would be, 2 weeks? Is that sort of standard, or what you think would give people the best opportunity?
Different states have different durations of early voting, but at least a couple of weeks of early voting would be helpful. As I'm sure most people know, being able to take off time from work on a Tuesday and have to wait in line anywhere from 5 minutes to a couple of hours can be burdensome and challenging. And the opportunity to vote not on a weekday, or to vote on a day that's not election day, to distribute the crowds, the lines, really helps people exercise that right.
And I'm a California voter, so I get an absentee ballot whether I want it or not. And by the way, I use it. And I don't have to have an excuse, right? I don't have to have a doctor's certificate or anything. How many states have gone that far? And is that the ideal for vote by mail?
I believe that at least at the beginning of last year, there were 33 states that had no excuse mail voting. And a number of states implemented no excuse mail voting last year because of the pandemic, recognizing that so many people would want to be able to exercise their right to vote safely from home. There are several bills in play this year that would expand no excuse mail voting to states that don't already have it. But yes, absolutely, there's no reason to limit that option to those with a handful of excuses that qualify. It's an extremely popular policy that's really effective and safe and secure, and it certainly should be available to every voter.
How about online voting? Is that restricted in any way? How many states are using that? I'm curious.
Really, no state permits actually voting online.
Oh, you said online registration, I guess, but not online voting, huh?
Yes, that's right. So that would be the ability to register to vote online. Right.
Yeah. I've always hoped and expected that someday we'll get to online voting, but we're not there. We're not there yet. But so it's really up to each state, isn't it, to determine how it's going to run its elections. But you point out there is a federal role, and the recommendations for now are included in this For the People Act, or H.R. 1, passed by Congress last year. I think it was the very first bill in this current Congress, actually. Where does that stand now, and what are its chances?
So yes, let me take a step back and say you're right that states have the authority to regulate elections in their states, and that's why we see things done differently across the country. And in large part, that helps states cater to their particular voters and their communities. But Congress has authority under the Constitution to write voting laws and to even supersede state voting laws. And that's why we have sort of keystone bills like the Voting Rights Act or the National Voter Registration Act, laws that make voter registration easier, laws that ensure that we can vote free from racial discrimination. And Congress is now considering two other big democracy reform bills. The first, as you noted, is H.R. 1, the For the People Act, which was introduced and passed in the House in 2019 and was reintroduced again as the first bill in the House this year. The other big democracy bill that we expect to see is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is a bill to restore the Voting Rights Act to make sure that everybody can vote free from racial discrimination.
And that bill has been introduced in the House, hasn't passed the House yet, has it? The John Lewis bill?
It passed the House in 2019, but I don't believe it's been reintroduced yet this session.
I see. There's a lot of talk about, well, first of all, you tell us, what's the importance of that John Lewis Voting Rights Act?
Well, it's really essential, and that's because in part of a 2013 Supreme Court decision, Shelby County versus Holder, which gutted a provision of the Voting Rights Act that established preclearance, which was the process by which certain jurisdictions would have to get their voting policy changes approved by the Department of Justice or a court in Washington, D.C. And those were jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination in voting. And the Supreme Court in 2013 said that the formula to determine which states were covered, which jurisdictions were covered, was too outdated, and that Congress needed to come up with a new formula. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, among other things, would create a new preclearance formula. It would also identify certain kinds of voting practices that are subject to preclearance no matter, what jurisdiction introduced them. And it would establish other transparency and notice provisions. It would introduce a different preliminary injunction standard. Overall, it would try to make sure that all of us have an equal and fair access to the ballot box, regardless of race.
Right. And that's the one act that people believe that when it will get through the House, when it gets through the House and gets to the Senate, that may trigger ending the filibuster if Republicans use the filibuster to block the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We will see how that plays out. So, Eliza, back in March 2020, President Donald Trump talked about, I think, the For the People Act or some of the measures that were being introduced to make it easier for people to vote. And as you know, he said, if we ever agree to that, you'll never have a Republican elected in this country again. So people are taking that as his direction in many states, aren't they?
Well, I think for too long in this country, voting access, voting rights has been a partisan political football. But policies that make it easier for eligible citizens to vote should have nothing to do with partisanship. And it's time for Congress to make participation in our democracy easier for everyone. That includes Republicans and Democrats. And that way, politicians can fight on a fair playing field. They can appeal to voters, try to persuade voters, and everyone can have an equal and fair access to the ballot. And that's really all that H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act would do.
Bill Press with Eliza Sweren-Becker, counsel for the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Michael Mann, Kerry Haynie, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.